the first thing I did was for 2 weeks, I gave myself 20 minutes a night and forced myself with that very book that I once loved and then felt I couldn't read because I was too distracted. I forced myself to read more slowly. And eventually it took almost 2 weeks of just slowing myself down.
We'll kickstart this segment with the reading brain in the digital world, where you will learn about the reading brain and the importance of deep reading practices in today's digital world. We're very excited today to have world-renowned reading advocate, cognitive neuroscientist, and author of the acclaimed book, Reader Come Home, The Reading Brain in a Digital World. Please give a very warm welcome to our speaker for the session, Maryanne Wolf. Marianne, please.
Hello to all of you. I see from the chat you're from all over the world, and I'm coming to you not in the morning, but in the evening in Los Angeles, California. Um, my first slide actually is showing the reading brain, and my second slide is showing where I'm from, which is University of California, UCLA in Los Angeles. But I want to begin with telling you about what our mission is, and that is the concept of literacy, to change it around the world so that we understand that literacy is a basic human right across all learners, all ages, all backgrounds, all zip codes, all countries. The next slide is showing you something that is more historical, where we are in this moment of our history. And it is like a hinge moment where we've had three major historical changes from becoming an oral culture, from moving from an oral culture to a written culture, and now this really fast hinge moment between being a literate culture and moving into a digital one. Next slide, please. And I wanted to have three slides that actually come as a, a kind of context for what we're going to be talking about, which is the differences that different technologies make for how we read, and how we read affects who we are as an individual and culture and a species. The wonderful philosopher Walter Ong said something very important years ago, that technologies are not mere exterior aids, but also interior transformations of consciousness, and never more so than when they affect the word. So I want you to realize that though I'm a neuroscientist and will be talking about how the brain changes with different forms of reading, but I'm really just like Walter Ong, talking about how these technologies change the interior consciousness of the individual. The next slide is really looking at the fact that as we study this, it takes multiple disciplines. That when we really think about text, that we need to know the historical consciousness of what a text is at any one given time. What is the difference between a Twitter and Middlemarch? What those differences are going to also be an important factor in how we understand changes to the reading brain. And the next slide is really because of the very important theme in your conference. So the next slide will actually give us a sense of how we put those disciplines together that I am particularly interested in, so that we understand from the standpoint of cognitive neuroscience how cognitive behaviors change in our children and our adults, and how this information can be useful for librarians. Many of you I know are working in libraries, or clinics, or schools, universities, how all this is changing the behaviors inside classrooms. Next slide, please. Now, one of the things that, next slide, I'm going to be saying that a lot. Um, the One of the things that I want to actually begin with is the simple fact that we weren't born to read. And when we learn to read, that act changes the brain of an individual. And those individuals change society. And together, these changes in the brain of individuals and societies actually is changing the future of our species. So one of the real, if you will, take-home messages is that as literacy changes, so also does our species. Next slide. Now, we are living in this amazing moment, but in terms of evolution, it's only 6,000 years that we've been able to read. And there are important implications to that. It means that our brains, which are about 50,000 years old, this version of our cerebral cortex, etc., it had to make a new circuit for itself because reading isn't in there. Reading is only able to happen because our brain possesses this beautiful ability to connect its parts that are genetically programmed. So the reading circuit didn't exist. It's built up, it develops, it changes, and it's plastic. Now, the implication of having a plastic reading brain circuit is that this will reflect differences, as you'll see in the next slide, differences, for example, in the writing system and in the medium. So our ability to build this circuit from older parts is, in essence, a dependent plasticity that will change with the writing system. And there's so many different writing systems that you have that, in fact, if we would look at just the people who are watching this video, we would find that there's so many different ways that the circuit reflects the particulars of the writing system. But it also reflects the medium with which that reader is reading. In the next slide, you're going to see a few different types of writing systems. And the first that I have, and this is a very modest view, you'll see it grow over time, but we have a pretty standard alphabet-like circuit. Now, if you look below at Chinese and Japanese kanji, you'll see that the circuit is different. It's got many parts that are the same, the universal parts, but because there are so many characters that a Chinese child has to learn by 5th grade, probably up to 5,000 characters, the brain has to reflect that. So you will see right here on that second line that the right hemisphere of the brain in the visual areas has more cortical space that's devoted to learning all those characters. The whole point of this is that the circuit is going to reflect its environment, the environment of the writing system, the environment of the educational system, and the environment of the medium. Next slide, please. So if we think about the young child, that child, and I'm going to do this pretty fast now, one slide after another, that child has to build up a circuit. Now, it happens right from the start, not just when you're reading, but you're developing the parts. So one of the things that I always tell parents and educators around the world is that time between 0 and 5 is very important for building up language, cognition, affect, because each of those parts have to develop. And then when the child is 5 to 7, they start getting connected in the circuit. Next slide. And that child is going to use so much of language, the phonemes, the sounds of language, going to use the vocabulary. The words are so important for a child to have. The syntax of a given language, the morphology, the morphology meaning those units of meaning. And when I think of all the writing systems so many of you are using, all of those parts are being developed between 0 and 5. Next slide. So the component parts of language, if you will, have real, there are real advantages to knowing in every culture that we can do our part to develop that. And here you have a great slide of a mother reading to a child. Nothing is more important than speaking and reading to your child those first 5 years. Beginning from the time the child is under the crook of an arm, that is important because it's building up the language regions. And if you next slide here, you'll see that these language regions are not only the receptive ones for understanding, but also the expressive. Next slide, please. Now, there is a catch, which every culture has to understand. Now, I use this phrase from the Bible: the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. That's true for our brain. There are two stories. Those children who have this rich background in language and cognition, and those who don't. It's really important for all of you who are really seriously thinking about the next generation that we ensure that the kids get this background knowledge, because that's going to help them understand what they read. Next slide. Now, it's not just cognitive and linguistic development, it's also emotional development and social development that early reading is giving our child. Now, I don't know how many of the books that my kids read, every culture has all these different stories, but so many cultures have stories of friendship, of friends doing good things to each other when there are troubles. Each story introduces a child to the beginning of leaving themselves and understanding what it feels like to be another person, another animal, another thing. And this is so important for the origins of empathy. Next slide, please. All of this contributes to what the philosopher Martha Nussbaum called the compassionate imagination. We are building that in our children with our books. We are building it in our adolescence and in all the way till the end of our lives. We are building a compassionate imagination as we consider through books, through literature, who other is. This is one of the most important things for our planet. And my country has been suffering in part because of a failure to understand truly the perspective of others. And never has that been more important than these days. Next slide, please. Now, how do we move this circuit from a child who's 5, who's developed all the parts, to what we really want, which is what I call deep reading? And I know Nicholas Carr was speaking to you, and years ago we had a wonderful interview in which I told him I use this term deep reading to describe a panoply, next slide please, of processes that are allowing us to move beyond the text into our own thinking processes. And Proust said something so beautiful, that the heart of reading is when we leave the wisdom of the author behind to discover our own. And in the next slide, you'll see that from a cognitive viewpoint, there are multiple processes. Here are some of them. One that I just talked about is background knowledge. What do you know that allows you to make an analogy between what you know and what the text gives you? We are analogy makers, and so it's really important to know that part of what you do when you read is to make connections between what you know and what you don't know, and then to make inferences, deductions from that information. Next slide, please. As I use the work of Alberto Manguel in so many ways, he personifies both the best of readers and the best of writers about reading. And in his history of reading, he really makes so clear that reading is cumulative, that what we read helps us, almost like a geometric progression in our thought, to build upon what we have read before. Everything matters. Next slide, please. And the work of a theologian, my former teacher and wonderful friend and mentor, the late John Donne, used the term passing over to describe what happens in reading. And even if he was talking more theologically and philosophically, I think the same term is about empathy and perspective taking. One of the more time-consuming processes we do is when we immerse in reading and become able to take on the perspective of others. As I said, this is like what Martha Nussbaum called the compassionate imagination. Empathy is growing. Next slide, please. And one of the interesting things is that fiction is a great way for us to become ever more empathic. There's a beautiful line. What's a piece of fiction? What's a novel? What's a short story? It's a piece of consciousness being passed from mind to mind. Next slide, please. And this is something that I liken to what Frank Hockenmulder calls our own personal moral laboratory. All of this growth of empathy is actually not just about compassion. It's about being able to think ethically and morally how we relate to others. And in the next slide, you'll see that, next slide, please. You'll see something that I consider very interesting. Our former President Barack Obama had an interview with the great novelist, my favorite novelist almost of the 20th century, certainly, Marilynne Robinson. And he had an interview with her because he considered her an ambassador of empathy. And he said he learned more about empathy from novels because that's where he saw that others weren't black and white, but filled with gray. And Marilynne Robinson said something so beautiful for every culture. The trend towards seeing those different as sinister other is the greatest danger to continuing our democracy. In whatever countries all of you come from, in whatever governments, we need to be able to have a rapprochement in our world with those that have been deemed others. And that is something that books, literature, especially fiction, is teaching us about. Next slide, please. Now, not only do the literary and the theologian scholars have something to say about this, but so also do the neuroscientists. And in Germany, Tanja Singer has done some great work with her lab that shows us that not only when we read do we have empathy, and not only is empathy about compassion, but when we take on the perspective of others, we are learning something about their mind, what we call in cognitive psychology, the theory of another mind. If you think only of Machiavelli, you can see how important it is to understand not only how a person feels, but how another person thinks. Next slide, please. Now, one of the people that I liken to a really important person to understand the reading brain is Sherlock Holmes. Actually, Miss Marple, too, for those of you who might know the British female detective. But everybody knows Sherlock Holmes. And why? Because he can take facts and infer from them. What does he infer? What does he induce? What does he deduce? Well, those are what I call the scientific cognitive processes that require time of us in order to have critical analysis. The two most important aspects of that reading brain that will allow us to fight distraction, to learn how to think and contemplate are critical analysis and empathy. Next slide, please. And critical analysis is so connective. It's taking what we know, all that background knowledge, what we infer, but it also allows us to make hypotheses. And there's sort of like a right and left frontal lobe dance that goes on to make hypotheses so that we evaluate. Now, think about what I'm saying. All of these processes take time. And this is, again, something that Nicholas Carr and I have thought a great deal about in our very different ways. When you require extra time, do you give it? So one of the things that I want you to realize right now is there's a direct connection between the time you give critical analysis and your ability to discern the truth value, whether something is fake news or false information. So when you do not have people who are using critical analysis and empathy, you have less, you have a more vulnerable group of people with their ability to gauge and discern the truth value. Next slide, please. Moving on, we get to the platform that goes beyond all of what I've just been saying. Now, this doesn't always happen, and I wish I could say that I always give so much time to critical analysis and empathy that I have the time in milliseconds for insight and generativity. It's not true. That's the acme of reading. When we leave, just as Proust said, leave the text behind and have our own thoughts. I call this the Proustian pause, but it's the time of insight. It's the time where the contemplative, reflective parts of reading can give us, in my thinking, an antidote to the age and landscape of distraction that we're all living through and in. Next slide, please. Now, most of you will think, who the heck is this monk? Well, yesterday was for a feast day of St. Thomas Aquinas. I am using him here because he, in a biography by G.K. Chesterton, said, when he was asked, what are you most grateful for in life? He said he was most grateful that he understood every page he ever read. I only wish that were true for all of you. It certainly is not true for me. But I use him because I wanted his beautiful intellect to be between the two hemispheres that show all the myriad of processes we use when we are fully immersed in reading and being critically analytic and empathic and in a contemplative stance. Next slide, please. Now, of course, that doesn't always happen, but it takes time, not only in milliseconds by adults, but it takes years to develop. And I can't insist enough or emphasize that part of our job as stewards of the next generation is to instill a love of that kind of deep reading in our young and teaching how important it is. It is not a given, and it has never been less a given than in a digital age. Next slide, please. And here we're going to move for the next 15 minutes into a discussion of what that deep reading brain is like in a digital context. And there are great differences. Next slide. Now, I want to contextualize what I say by insisting that there are no binaries in what I'm saying. I'm not talking about the past medium and the future mediums are traditional or innovative, and I'm not pitting print against digital. Rather, what I want all of us to realize, especially with the very ironic fact that you wouldn't be listening to me without digital technologies, we need to understand, just as my colleague Sherry Turkle said, that it's not an opposition to the innovative, but it's a necessity to know, just as she said, what is disrupted or diminished by any one medium. So it's not that we're transgressing, as she says, because we're building all these new mediums and all these new digital activities. Not at all. But we transgress if we do not allow ourselves, not just allow ourselves, force ourselves to consider what is disrupted or diminished by a medium. Next slide, please. So one of the things that I am doing, along with colleagues like Patricia Greenfield, is looking at what the cost and weaknesses are in different mediums. Now, we know that digital gives us the democratization of knowledge, access to knowledge, ability to take huge amounts of information and to process it quickly. So there's an enormous gain in that kind of intelligence. But there's a cost that she and I agree totally on. And that is there's a cost to the time given to deep processing, to consolidating knowledge, to induction, to critical analysis, to imagination, and very importantly, to reflection. What goes missing when you skim is reflection. Next slide, please. Now, I've been looking along with my colleagues like Naomi Barron, and she's a brand new book that I'd love people to read. I've been looking at some of these questions about memory, about attention, and why in so many of our young, attention is just this fleeting, and Linda Stone used this term, continuous partial attention. Next slide, please. So we're looking at some of the evidence. Moving that next slide along, please, Parat. We've been looking at this, and what I want to do with you as I look at the evidence right now in the next few minutes, I want to look at it with the context. Another philosopher, but this one 600 years ago, who said that when two things have truths in it, but that coincide and they seem to cancel each other out, don't think about them as canceling, but rather look at them from a stance of learned ignorance. And learned ignorance, not learned, learned, in which we're saying, what are these advantages? What are these disadvantages? And look at them with an open eye. Next slide, please. And I use that context to look at the next pieces of evidence. Our young are not ready to be on an iPad at 6 months, 1 year, and 16 to 18 months, and yet they are. I'm working with pediatricians to try to understand how best to handle the fact that the iPad has become a babysitter and a pacifier. When we know from people like Catherine Hirsch-Pasek that language development is more, if you will, developing when it's human interaction, not all the screens. So the evidence in the very young is to help us, if you will, modulate what is becoming for so many people a babysitter. Next slide, please. Now we see from clinicians and pediatric neurologists actual brain images of children who are being read to in different mediums and what the effect is on the activation in language regions. So what you see here is that when you have parents read or caretakers read, the language regions are more activated than when the kids just hear the very same story in an audio version, or even more than in an animated version on a screen. It appears that all those bells and whistles are actually distracting the child from thinking more carefully, more imaginatively. So even though there are many positive things that, of course, in some of the apps for children, it is the case that language is being more activated by us humans. Next slide. Now, when we look at slightly older children, what we see is that our clinicians are telling us that they are truly as distracted as can be. And this distraction takes away from consolidation of information in memory. Now, this means that these kids are being unable to inhibit distraction. Now, so are you. So am I. We are programmed to be genetically looking at what is a novel reflex. And there's all kinds of evolutionary evidence for this. We are built like that. But people who make games, people who make apps, sometimes use design principles that are going after that natural propensity for distraction. That is a problem in the building of attention and concentration in our young, and it also is bathing them in these fight-flight hormones. Next slide, please. So we look at changes in attention in our youth, and we are looking at it in many different ways. The eRead Network is a wonderful group of people who over the last years have been looking at one study after another, people like Anne Mangan. In the next slide, you'll see the work of Sal Moran and his students, in which they have done meta-analysis. Now imagine this. They have taken one huge study of 54 other studies, out of which there are 171,000 young people who are participating over these years, 2000 to 2017. One task: read the same story on different mediums, print versus screen. Then you ask them comprehension questions. Go back, please, to the, you ask comprehension questions, and they are better in print than they are on the screen. Now, caveat, they think they're better on the screen. And they say, well, I'm better on my iPad or my computer because I'm faster. Not realizing that the speed with which they're reading is actually taking away from the speed with or the time that they should be allocating to critical analysis. Now, this is a very important finding, and there's a sub-finding. They analyzed only the last years as well of the quote-unquote most digital native of the subjects, and the print effect was even stronger. We have to take this with great seriousness. It's not saying no digital. We're all on digital. But it is saying we have to seriously understand what is being disrupted and diminished when they are reading in this screen mode. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we are trying to figure out is what's going on. And a colleague from San Jose, Professor Liu, is showing us that basically we're all becoming skimmers. What does a skim do? Goes quickly. What happens when you're doing everything so fast? You are missing pieces of information. You're missing beauty as well. You are missing sometimes the very texture, the very most important quality of written language. But I'm going to reserve that for a little later. But cognitively, it means we're looking at things in a different way. We are not looking at it in a sustained, immersive way. Next slide, please. So skimming is the new normal with many an adult, and there are implications. It means that there's going to be reduced time for deep reading. That's the bottom line of this talk, that if you are skimming away, you are going to have less time for understanding complexity. Just think about the horror that at least my country has lived through, in which policy was being made through tweets. There's no complexity of the issues possible in a few characters. This is reducing our complexity. It's reducing our ability to be empathic, because often enough, people are going to, because there's so much information and they're skimming it, they go to only their own personal silos of information. This is disastrous for a culture, because it means they're not getting the perspective of others to at least look at, to understand, because understanding is not one perspective. Understanding is the integration of multiple pieces of information. The sum of this is that not only do they lose the ability to discern the truth value often enough, because they just assume it's true, it's their familiar silo of information, it makes them susceptible to false information and demagoguery. This is a direct insult to our intellectual capacities, but it's a threat to democracy. Next slide, please. Now, there's a wonderful dialogue between the great writer Umberto Eco and Cardinal Martini, in which really what they're talking about in democracy is the dialectic. This is what I've been saying in a different way, that a democracy requires multiple voices and a dialectic of opinions and beliefs, because that is what helps make a moral conscience for a society. And that is the basis for having multiple others live together in our very connected planet. Next slide, please. So I am looking in the last few slides at who's the good reader today. And I look at Aristotle, who said that there are three, if you will, types of lives that a good society has to have. One is one that is active and productive with knowledge, one that has entertainment and enjoyment, and one that has contemplation. I suggest to you that our good reader has a lot of activity and productivity and entertainment, but that the true good reader has a hard time in a landscape of distraction to give the time necessary for contemplation, and it's never been more important. Next slide, please. I use this beautiful quote from John Donne, that in these three lives of the good society, we have the first two, but we are lacking this third one, and there are consequences. Next slide. And one of the consequences is directly part of the theme of your conference today, and that is, how do we live in an age of distraction? And Lance Straight said this, that we live in a media environment that places a premium on images and immediacy, that floods us with entertainment and drowns us with distractions and diversions. We have to think about what are the antidotes to that. Next slide, please. And one of the most powerful antidotes is reading. To read, and I quote from David Ulin, is to give a certain kind of silence that's increasingly elusive in our over-networked society, where knowledge can't help but fall prey to illusion that speed can lead us to illumination. That speed is more important, or it's more important to react than to think deeply. I suggest to you, along with David Ulin, that reading itself, deep reading, is an act of contemplation, an act of resistance in a landscape of distraction. Next slide, please. So I'm going to be ending here. It is not coincidental that a cognitive neuroscientist is using theologians and philosophers and media scholars and psychologists to come to the conclusion that it's up to us. It's up to all of us. And I love your conference and your goals. And I want to suggest that, along with Newsbound, it would be catastrophic if we become a nation of technically competent people who have lost the ability to think critically, to examine themselves and ourselves, and to respect the humanity and diversity of others. Reading is our antidote to this. It is our ability to leave ourselves, take on the perspective of others, and to think beyond even what that author said to our own best thoughts. So I wish you all the best in this conference and in your lives. May you stay well. May all of you help that next generation become deep readers, not only in print, but deep readers across any medium. Thank you so much for your kindness and your attention in inviting me.
Thank you, Marianne, for your enlightening sharing. We'll now move on to the Q&A segment. So we've had quite a lot of questions coming for you, and I will now pose a few. Just give me a minute. Okay, so we have one contributor who asks, I find it increasingly hard to read as I'm easily distracted. a common problem, I'm sure. What are the steps I can take to cultivate a deep reading habit?
Yes. Oh, it's a beautiful question. And I've written a book, which I know that your conference has listed. It's called Reader Come Home, The Reading Brain in a Digital World. And I wrote a series of letters in this book, and in it I described how I too am just as distracted as everyone else. And I found myself doing an experiment in which I looked at how I read a book that I once loved. And I just wanted to see how I read it. And I found myself as distracted as the person who asked this question. And I found also the beginning of a practice that I took on and that might be of help to your viewers. The first thing I did was for 2 weeks, I gave myself 20 minutes a night and forced myself with that very book that I once loved and then felt I couldn't read because I was too distracted. I forced myself to read more slowly. And eventually it took almost 2 weeks of just slowing myself down. And I felt, and that's part of the title, that by the end of that experience, I came home. But what do you do afterwards? And here I want to suggest to you what a habit that I have learned for myself. And it's not going to be for everybody. When I get up, I meditate, and then I literally go into what might even be called meditative reading. I choose something. For me, it's probably spiritual, philosophical, or theological, because they really slow you down. But intentionally, I slow myself down in the beginning of my day. And so it's always in print. Absolutely. I wouldn't touch a digital for 40 minutes in every day of my life. But then the rest of my day, like so many of you, it's full with digital. When I can, I read books. If there's anything important, I require every book publisher to send me, if they want a blurb, they have to send me the printed book because I know I read more carefully that way. But like you, like that person who asked the question, so much of my day is on every screen. At the end of my day, I have the second book end. And I dare say, I'm going to do something really strange. I don't know if you could see this, but are, these are the stacks of books. These are stacks of books that every night I choose and read for at least 20 to 40 minutes to an hour. So I have bookends for my day, the beginning and the end. And that has enabled me to feel that I can be more immersive even on a screen,
Mhm.
because this is balancing how I read.
Okay, thank you. And yes, that book stack does look familiar to me as well.
Yeah, you have stacks back there. Mine are not nearly so neat.
Of course. Okay, our next question. Something that I think all of us would be concerned with. As an adult, is it still possible to read more and develop our empathy and critical thinking?
There's nothing more beautiful than the realization that, just like Alberto Mangel said, everything you read builds upon what you've read. And the more that you read, that is giving you that sense of compassion, that sense of love of literature, of others, of beauty. You know, one of the things that I never get to really emphasize as a cognitive neuroscientist is the act of reading gives beauty. There was a wonderful passage from David Brooks, a journalist and essayist, and he said, somehow, somewhere, sometime, beauty went missing. And I wanted to write him really fast. It's because you're skimming, David Brooks. That's what happens. Words, Italo Calvino said that just the very choice of each word is so important to an author. And when we read and skim, boop, 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 we've missed half of the most hard-won words that an author put up. I'm not saying that every author does that, but I know that we try. We try. Reader Come Home is full of very hard-won words.
Yes, I'm sure we try as hard as we can.
That's right.
Okay, all right, thank you. And your next question, what is your perspective on audiobook versus ebook and print?
Yes. I have I hope what I would call a nuanced perspective, because I think audiobooks are great. I don't use them, but for those who do, I think it's a wonderful complement of background knowledge, especially. And if for those of you who have long commutes, what better use of your time than to be accumulating knowledge from books?
Mhm.
Now, I personally don't, but that's because by and large, I am a person who likes to go back.
Mhm.
And actually, the way the eye works, you are always going ahead, but you're picking up information ahead of you. But when you have made a mistake of any kind, you're also able to go quickly back and print. And in a screen and in audio, both, even
Mhm.
though you can, you don't. You don't rewind, and you more than likely don't, because on a screen you're like
It's
pushing
more of a
yourself.
hassle.
It's a hassle. And
Yeah.
so you have less what I call, or what is called, comprehension monitoring with the audio. And so even though I like it, and my sons, I have two sons, full disclosure, love them both. Neither of them have read my books. They have only listened to my books, both of them. And one is dyslexic, one is dysgraphic. And so for the dyslexic, he has a great amount of delight in being able to have audiobooks to complement him, because the laboriousness of print. So there's a lot of individual variation, but I am not opposed to audiobooks. It's a different, but there are differences, and comprehension monitoring is one of those.
Okay. Thank you, Marianne. Right. One more. We have a contributor who's an educator and says that I realized that I've been using a lot of digital resources as part of my lesson materials, and now I'm wondering if this is counterproductive. And
It's a
this person would
great
love to hear your thoughts on this.
Oh, I'm so happy. Whoever said that, yay, you. Okay, when I say there's no binaries, I really mean it. There are good things about digital, and there are negative. And in the book that I wrote, and I didn't have a chance with 40 minutes to really go into my concept of what I call the biliterate brain. And that biliterate brain is a developmental, if you will, plan in which children are using print, especially for the first 10 years, to learn how to read, but they're being complemented by digital knowledge. So what the teacher is doing, there are two things that are really important: practice of those important foundational skills. Kids kids really need practice in decoding and learning the rules that the letter and the sound goes together, the character and sounds go together. They need practice. They need systematic, structured practice. And the when the teacher has 20 to 40 children in front of him or her, they don't have a chance to do as much practice. And so the digital can be very helpful for practice, very helpful for giving complementary background knowledge. So what I don't want is to have this feeling of it's either or, but for those of you who really want to know what I think in a more, if you will, educated way, I write about that in letters 5 through 8 in the last book I wrote.
Oh, letters 5 through 8.
Yes,
Right.
they're all developmental, about what is going on with the developmental brain, what are
Mm.
the best ways of ultimately fashioning what I call that biliterate brain, which has parallel tracks, basically.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. All right. We have time for just one more question, a quick one. So this person says skimming is a way to read, and there are some reading courses that teach us how to read speedily. So what are your comments on this, on skimming?
What do you think? And I'll give you a better answer than that. Basically, I'm a skimmer too. Who isn't these days? You have massive amounts of information. You have to skim. But what I want is a discerning skimmer, and that is to know when and what the purpose of the material is. If it's important, please print it out and don't skim it. Read carefully.
Mm.
If it is something, excuse me, all of you who have ever sent me emails, I'm skimming. So it's to become a discerning reader, to know what the purpose of your reading is. That's what's so important. As for courses in skimming or speed reading, I have a lot of uh, well, more negative, pejorative things to say that I won't say publicly, because I just, but I won't say anything negative. I don't like to say negative
Mm.
things. But what I will say is, be a discerning skimmer when you must skim, and you will skim a lot of your day, but
Mm.
think, what is the purpose of my reading? And then decide whether you print it out or use a printed version. If anybody sees me on a plane pre-COVID and after COVID, you will see me with a
Mhm.
briefcase that has an iPad for some of the, if you will, the lightest novels that have ever been written, so that in 2 hours I'm finished, and you will see books in my briefcase of the ones that I want to read carefully for their beauty and for the gifts that books give us. So that's the answer.
All right. Thank you, Marianne.